Hey, André.
Hey,
Uh,
Arthur.
Pleasure to have you. I will give you obviously the space and time to introduce yourself. Maybe we can start from there. But André, founder and CEO of Incognia. Uh, yep, Mike is yours.
Right. Yeah, I'm André, one of the co-founders and CEO at Incognia. We're in the fraud prevention space, helping financial institutions and marketplaces distinguish between the good users and the fraudsters. So pleasure to be here.
We've had a few discussions before, and one of those discussions was about your background, your story, how you got to where you are today. Um, Personally, I think that story is incredible. So we'd love to maybe take some time to dive into it. Tell us where you come from, how you got to where you are, and like what you're really focusing on right now, especially in terms of problems that you're trying to solve.
I come from a family of nerds. My parents are both in the computer science and engineering space, and and basically through that background, I got a lot of like early access to stuff, particularly because my dad is a computer science professor, so he was always at the frontier, and yeah, got early access to like computers, the internet, etc. And I ended up developing an interest in actually I would say the side of breaking things. So hacking and that kind of stuff was my early interest in like trying to understand how to break systems, and that basically helped me create kind of this intuition for how to um, penetrate systems. I'd say, and that was always in the back of my mind. Like every time I saw anything that would my first reaction was to think like, how can I break into this? And I think this led me to where I'm at right now. Um, but before starting Cognia, when I was in college doing computer science, one of the key moments for me in terms of my background was when I started this research project around geolocation technologies. So the initial goal was to build a location technology that would solve the problem of indoor location where GPS does not work, right? So if you are like within a building, for example, the GPS is not able to understand which floor you were at, in which apartment, something like that. So the goal was to get to that level. And for the first like 5 years of my career was basically like just focused on that research project, trying to solve that problem. And when getting to that, I started seeing the potential for this technology. But it was a tricky situation because it was kind of a solution looking for a problem. So my research team and I, like we had a very sophisticated and interesting technology, but we didn't really have an application for it at the time. So we like spent a lot of time trying to find like the right problem to solve with this tech. And the first company we ended up creating was actually in a very different space. It was nothing related to hacking, security, fraud, etc. It was actually in the marketing industry. So we were basically using this location technology to help physical retailers drive foot traffic to their stores by advertising to users in their surroundings. So nothing related to what we're doing today, but that helped build a foundation and also helped me learn how to build a company, right? So that initial business did fairly well. We grew quite fast to like over 200 people. It became a profitable company. And during that phase, it was the moment in which I moved from Brazil to the US. And in 2020, when I made that move, the goal was to bring that business to the US market. Unfortunately, the timing wasn't great because it was right before the pandemic. I arrived here with like only two carry-on bags, looking for like an apartment in the Bay Area. And then the pandemic starts, and our customers who were physical retailers, they had to shut down their stores, right? So we saw revenues drop 95% in March 2020, and we had to adapt very quickly.
That's crazy.
Yes, it was an insane moment in my career, I'd say. And we didn't have a choice, right? We didn't know how long the pandemic would last, so we had to adapt very quickly. And because of this background and as I mentioned, this intuition around like breaking into systems, one of the things that I was fascinated about was that with the data that we were collecting, the location signals that we were collecting in the previous business, I could see that each individual had a very unique location behavior, and we could actually use that as an identity. It would be very secure because it was an identity that was always changing, right? As you moved around, as you went to new places, like that identity would morph into something new. So it was more of a live identity for users, and I always saw the potential for it in the security and fraud prevention industries. So in a moment in which we didn't have much choice, that was the one application that we decided to bet everything on it and pivot in that moment. And that's where Incognia was created. And I'm glad that we've made that decision, because nowadays Incognia is way bigger than the previous company. It is finally a global company. But it was for sure a very, very stressful moment, I'd say.
Well, first of all, congrats. Like most companies that had to make that kind of pivot, especially because of a pandemic, which is insane, right? Doesn't survive. I remember we talked about this a little bit, but whenever I used to play tennis, my coach used to say, focus on the things that you can control. The pandemic is not something that you can necessarily control, but how you reacted to it is finding ultimately the problem that you're currently solving, right? So maybe like now that you have Incognia and would love for the audience to better understand, like, what is Incognia? What is the mission that you guys are solving for, right? And then we'll go into like different things that we're currently seeing as well, which, APP fraud problems and things like this. And I think like those are topics that a lot of people are talking about that you solve for, that you tackle on a daily basis. So people are going to be really interested in it. But first, like, maybe a quick word on Incognia. What is it? What's the main value proposition ultimately? And how could I use it, for example?
Absolutely. Yeah. So what is the thesis behind Incognia, right? The key insight behind it is that back in 2020, we were starting to see like the early things about AI and like deepfakes, and this was already coming up in like deepfake being used in content to like try to steer elections, for example, and things like that. And we were seeing that and thinking like, at some point, most of the signals that are currently used to identify users online are going to be spoofed, are going to be faked, and AI is going to accelerate that, right? So for example, if we think about like facial recognition, document verification, even like device IDs, behavior biometrics, like all of these things in some way are being affected by AI nowadays. And this is going to it is already causing a lot of disruption in the industry, right? So the thought behind it was, what is the signal that would be harder for AI to fake? And the insight behind it is that the signal that would be hardest is whatever is grounded to what's happening in physical reality, right? And location is directly tied to that. But the problem is the current state of location technologies from a spoofing standpoint is also very vulnerable. So for example, if you think about IP addresses, which usually people use to locate users, it's very easy to spoof that. You can use a VPN, a proxy, and you can easily spoof it. GPS, it is also extremely easy to spoof GPS information. You can download a fake GPS application, you can set your device to developer mode, and you can spoof it very easily. So we had to bring up to the market a better location technology that was harder to spoof. So that was basically the reason why we decided to build this product, was that we already had a very sophisticated location technology that enabled us to locate devices within buildings, understanding different floors, different apartments, etc. So that was the core insight: building a digital identity that is grounded in physical reality and is adapting as users move around, making it much harder for someone else to impersonate you, for example. How can you use Incognia, right? So we sell to other companies. So we sell to financial institutions, we sell to marketplaces, and our technology is embedded into their applications or websites. So for example, when you're logging into your bank on a mobile device or on the browser, basically our technology is behind the scenes evaluating the location behavior of that device and trying to understand how similar and how likely is that device linked to you, right? Based on what we already know about your behavior. And we're able to do that without any personal information. So we don't need to know your name, your phone number, your email address. We're able to do that in a privacy preserving way, just focusing on the device and its behavior versus trying to get down to understanding who's the individual behind the screen. And that's basically the approach. So nowadays we are embedded in hundreds of applications, and we have over 1.5 billion devices in our network, which means that we're protecting over 1 billion users globally in multiple countries.
Well, as you were kind of talking, the hacker came out quite a few times with like, this is very easy to do, this is very easy to do. Maybe for you. For me, it wouldn't have been as easy, I guess, to get a little close something. But first, like, again, congrats, like, as a little foreigner. It's not simple coming into a country. You had to face the pandemic, you had to pivot a few times. And here you are with a hyper successful company. Diving into a bit of a separate topic, right? One of the topics we wanted to do a deep dive on today is APP fraud and the problems around it. Maybe we can start with, what is APP fraud and why does it matter?
Well, so APP fraud is one of the most challenging things because it is the concept of an authorized push payment, right? That's why APP. What authorized means here is that it is the actual person, the owner of that account, making that payment. The problem is they don't really know who they're sending that money to. They're being scammed, right? So essentially, that happens in actually a few ways, right? For example, there is the bank impersonation scam, which is very common and leads to APP fraud, which is someone is going to call you. They're going to claim that they work for the bank and that there is potentially something wrong with your account. And to protect your money, you should send your money to a secure account, which is controlled by that person who tells you that they are from the bank. In fact, they're not from the bank, right? They're just a scammer. But they are quite smart, right? When they reach out to you, they already have a lot of personal information on you, because there's probably a data breach where your information was present on, or maybe you post a lot of information on social media and the scammer was able to capture that information, right? The other thing is that many times they are spoofing the phone numbers. So it actually looks like it's the bank who's calling you, right? And basically because of that, they're able to put the end user in an emotional state in which they're very vulnerable, and they end up doing things that they shouldn't, right? Many times when we're transferring funds on a bank, at online bank, for example, you have these notices and warnings, but people, when they're in that emotional state, they just don't pay attention. And many times the scammer is going to tell you oh, you're going to see this message, but don't worry about it, etc. It's all fine. I'm from the bank. So anyways, it's very tricky, because if you look at the traditional signals, everything looks fine, right? It's the device that typically uses that account. From a location standpoint, the user is probably going to be at a trusted location like their home or their office, for example. So everything looks fine. The problem is really that this is much harder to detect. So how can we identify these things, right? The key areas are related to understanding, for example, if there's any kind of manipulation going on. So for example, one of the things that's possible to do on mobile is to monitor is if the device is currently on a call, right? If there's an active call, you can monitor for that. That is, for example, one, I wouldn't say a red flag necessarily, but at least a yellow flag, right? The second thing that you can also look for, which is very common in the behavioral biometric space, is looking for like signs of hesitation and things like that. The problem with that approach is that the false positive rates can be quite high because the user might just be distracted, for example. So the false positives could be high in a scenario like this. And I would say that the most important thing, and actually there's very promising news recently about it, is looking at the other end of the transaction. Who are you sending money to, right? So is this a new payee? You never sent money to that account before. Is there any history with that account in terms of like multiple users adding that account as a new payee as well and reporting fraud later? So trying to identify if that is a mule account, I would say is the most important signal here. And recently there was this new FinCEN 314B in which basically incentivizing the banks to share more fraud data. I think that's very promising because then they can start sharing who are the mule accounts, and location is actually a signal that can contribute a lot to identify mule accounts.
So it sounds like, data can solve for that, which is of course what Incognia is doing. I like to dumb things down
All right.
quite a bit. So let me do that for a second. Today, when, let's say I'm the person that's getting scammed, right? How do financial institutions or those organizations deal with it? What recourse do I have, right, to potentially just not be scammed?
Yeah. Well, it's very tricky, right? Because like one of the key things that many financial institutions rely on today is still on running campaigns to educate their customers. The problem is,
You can say it.
this is not really the top priority for anyone, right? It actually doesn't work that well. And the effort and the amount of money that is invested in those campaigns it's incredible. Like I've seen in some cases like some large financial institutions like running ads on TV to like let their customers know that they are not going to be called by the bank. Like fine, but I mean like the end user, like who cares? Like they're not really paying that much attention to these things. And again, like when it comes to these scammers, like they are professionals. They know what they're doing. The victim is not a professional. So there is an asymmetry here that's very important to take into consideration. So I would say like consumer education doesn't really work. There are technologies that can really address the problem, and this is where the financial institutions should be focusing on. The other thing is the regulatory environment, which is tricky, right? In each country, you have like different regulations. In some countries, for example, the banks are being forced to reimburse their customers regardless of the fact that the money was sent by the owner of the account, right? But in some places, these customers are not being reimbursed, right? So this makes it more challenging. But I would say most of the initiatives today are not really effective, but there is technology that can solve the problem.
It sounds like technology on the back end is what will resolve it. Educating people, like ultimately, like maybe you and I, which I would consider us nerds, hopefully no offense there, but we're nerds, right? We might actually pay attention to it. We're in that space. The common, like the people that are out there, right? Common Joe or Ben, or whichever the case is, like they may not ultimately know about this, right? And even if they do, I mean, we all have like a million things to take care of. Understanding APP fraud is just not one of the priorities. So technology on the back end as an infrastructure can definitely help solve for that. I agree on the educational components being ineffective, which is why like the problem persists, right? And I think you mentioned a very important topic, which is the regulatory framework. Pretty sure you mentioned some countries reimburse. I think the UK is one of them, but you have other countries which is not the case. I guess a question on that front, do you think there should be more of a global or at least a region-wise um, type of regulatory framework that enables maybe more reimbursements? Do you think that could help the customers at the end of the day? Could that be something also empowered by technology? Meaning like, hey, Incognia ultimately looked at all of the signals that were present. We flagged this, right? Like, because of that, we give you almost like a 3DS, right? Does in certain cases, we give you 100% of the time the funds back to the customer because we are the one we're taking the risk. Are those things that you're seeing? What do you think about that potential strategy?
Yeah, I would say that a regional regulation, like it would be great, but it's unlikely given the like very complex coordination effort involved in that. I believe that at some point we're going to see like more initiatives towards like self-regulation between financial institutions in multiple regions, um, and what's particularly promising is that like not only Incognia, but you have many providers of technology they're global in nature, right? So for example, we are in 190 countries. We do have visibility into financial transactions cross-border, for example, which is also quite related to some of these scams as well. Um, so yeah, I would say particularly when it comes to data sharing between financial institutions, I think there is a very promising space. The tricky part is when it comes to data sharing, like some data points are quite strategic and financial institutions are a little bit more worried about sharing them. So for example, anything related to like personal information that can be potentially used for marketing campaigns, like that's the kind of stuff that financial institutions don't want to share because that might lead a competitor to reach out to their customers, for example, right? So how can you do this in a privacy preserving way in which you're able to flag the accounts that are suspicious without having to share like all of the information about every single account, for example, like only sharing the bad stuff. So I would say that's one of the things that we're facilitating for some financial institutions, but it's not an easy conversation, and it requires education on the financial services companies.
Maybe even from your experience, right? You were at one of the leading US banks, right? You had the front row seats and they had, very robust behavioral technology that they were using and ultimately also said they could stop APP fraud, right? And I'm going to be very direct to the question. What happened? Were they able to actually do it? Did that happen?
Well, we actually have a few cases of financial institutions that they were using allegedly the best-in-class solutions for like behavioral biometrics and device fingerprinting and facial recognition, etc. But it was still not stopping the fraudsters, right? And one of the key reasons was because they were too focused on the behavioral traits on the user that was sending the money, but they were not really looking too deeply into what's happening with the receiving end of the transaction, right? So mule account detection particularly is one of the problems that very few financial institutions were able to address up to this point because they didn't really have the best data to solve it. This is actually one of the primary use cases for our data nowadays with financial institutions, which is understanding the mule account behavior by analyzing the location associated to that account. So, for example, there are two moments in which we see that happening. The first one is a mule account. Like the problem with it and the challenge with it is that it is the right person creating the account in the first place, right? So the onboarding checks, like everything looks fine. The IDV is perfect. The KYC process it's all good. So basically, the identity that was used to create that account is legitimate, and it was that person creating the account. Then that person either hands over the account to another individual, or they are coerced to run some specific financial transactions on behalf of someone else, right? So there are these two ways of doing this. For the first one, what we would see with location data is that a new device is now accessing this account, and the location behavior of this new device does not match the location behavior of the original device. So that would be one flag. The other flag would be related to understanding the location behavior of this new device and seeing if other accounts are also associated to that one location. So for example, we recently found a mule account network in which in a single apartment, you had 200 devices accessing 4,500 accounts. It was a very large scale operation with only one individual in one apartment, right? So you can see like how scalable these things can get.
That's a full business. That is
Exactly.
like a full business. Okay.
Exactly. So that was like one thing that we found, but we find these things like every single day. So location can help a lot on identifying the account handovers. For the second case here, you don't really see that behavior because like the user is being coerced, but they're still managing that account. But what you can see then is the accounts that they're sending money to demonstrate that first behavior of the mule accounts that were handed over, right? So in some way you can identify the mule account behavior using location signals, and with that we're now enabling a lot of financial institutions identify the risk of APP scam by looking at the receiving end of the transaction. But APP scams are very, very difficult to address, and you need like multiple layers of data to really catch it.
First of all, it's brilliant. Second of all, it's also brilliant. But I guess for me, and maybe we won't go there yet, but the first thing that starts coming to mind is, okay, great. Like right now you have potentially, humans behind the creation of those accounts and everything else. Down the road, right? And I think that's also something else that we can touch on at some point. Agents are also going to be potentially opening accounts and other things like this, and being able to detect the technology that you're creating, being able to detect that from an agentic point of view would be really interesting, because you lose, and that's the part, you lose all of the behavioral components, right, of humans. And so now you have to rely on something else, and it sounds like you're relying on the good part, which is, if it's an agent, if it's someone else, it won't matter if you have identified the mule accounts, the mule networks, and where the money is, and that's where you start having those flags. Really, really interesting. On one very important piece that I wanted to touch on is how Incognia actually detects like those mule accounts, right? Like we keep talking about, and you've told us about the mule account, their existence, how it can be running to a network. How does ultimately Incognia, like find out that those mule accounts exist? What are the signals that you guys are looking at?
So the two main things are related to the device identification and the location behavior, right? So when it comes to the device identification, essentially what we want to see is this account being consistently being accessed by the same devices, right? Because usually like you only switch your laptop or your phone every like 1 or 2 years, for example. So it's not like this account should be accessed by multiple accounts by multiple devices, right? So this is one thing that we want to analyze. And whenever there is a new device accessing this account, we want then to understand if the location behavior is matching the old device, right? So for example, here in the US, we typically have over 100 million mobile devices being set up every year, right? It's basically people buying new iPhones, new Android phones, etc. So it's a pretty large volume. So that basically means that on average, people are switching devices every 2 years. When that happens, you will have to log into your bank account from that new device, right? And what we see in our network in terms of location behavior is that 95% of the time, this occurs in what we call a trusted location. These are basically the places that you go most frequently. So for example, this would be your home, your office, right? Places that you go frequently, that you spend a lot of time on. So this is usually where you do that like first login to your bank account on a new device. So if that first login is not occurring at a trusted location, that is already a flag, right? But it might be near one of your trusted locations, which is okay too. The tricky thing is when we see that this new login is occurring from a location where we've seen multiple accounts being accessed from as well, right? So going back to that other example of the 200 accounts being accessed from the same apartments, that's kind of the signal that we would see and understand, like, okay, the likelihood that this is a mule account is extremely high.
You would need a massive amount of data, though, in order to identify that so many of those are being opened directly from that one place. So you guys must be working with an insane amount, 1 billion, right?
Yes, exactly. So nowadays we have a network of over 1 billion devices globally. It's almost 1.5 billion now. And the interesting thing is that the identifiers that we create for these devices are shared across applications and websites. So for example, if I have accounts with like 5 different banks, each of these apps should have a different identifier for the device, but we are able to unify that and have a single identifier that is shared across these 5 apps. So this is one of the things that would help us identify that multiple accounts are being accessed from that device. But the other thing is that sometimes these mule networks are also linked to multiple devices. So one of the things we see in our network is that 60% of the fraudsters, they operate with 10 or more devices. So we would be able to identify that these 10 plus devices are all in that same apartment, for example. So that would be one signal. The other is that usually these fraudsters are trying to clean up their device IDs very frequently. So one of the things they do is they would reset the device to factory setting every time they're blocked by a bank, for example. And when they reset their device, it generates a new device identifier. 70% of the devices that commit fraud, they are reset every week. So basically the bank would think that this is a new user, but in fact it's still the same. What we're able to do is, because of the location data, we can see, okay, there was an iPhone 16 Pro in the apartment 11B committing fraud, we blocked them. And now there is a clean iPhone 16 Pro in that same apartment. Well, it must be the same person with the same device, right? So we would basically link these two device identifiers and say, like, okay, this was a device reset. So those are some of the things that we monitor so that we can create a more persistent way of identifying these mule networks.
It sounds like, again, and there's a line in your framework that I love, which is detection without a disruption mechanism is just reporting. What does a proper disruption look like on the UX side?
First of all, you don't really want to educate the fraudster that much. So many times you just want to disable certain functionalities. So for example, let's say we detected that this is a mule account. We're not going to allow this account to receive any funds, but the fraudster can still log in to that account, right? So they're not really going to be 100% blocked, but we're going to block the feature that is used to commit the fraud, right? So some of these things I would say are important, and that basically forces them to have to either abandon that account or try to call the bank and justify what's going on, etc. But we basically create some friction there for the fraudster, to try to push them, because they're not going to stop being a fraudster, right? They're not going to come clean and say like, okay, now I'm going to be a good citizen. Like, no, that's not going to happen. They're usually going to attack another organization that maybe they become an Incognia customer and get rid of that fraudster as well. But that's one of the things. Obviously, when we're talking about like very large scale things, let's say this case of like an individual with like 4,500 accounts, this is the type of thing in which the financial institution will like reach out to authorities and try to use that data to help them identify that individual and bring them to justice. But that is not the most common thing that happens. The vast majority of the cases are more related to like blocking specific functionalities or blocking the accounts or blocking the devices.
One of the topics that we haven't necessarily touched on is AI, right? I think it's fair to say today that fraudsters are probably, in my opinion, some of the smartest people on earth, because no matter what kind of technology you put in place, or no matter what technology are coming to actually just the technology is disrupting the world, fraudsters always find a way. So I'm not surprised that they will continue to do so. What's the role of AI right now in fraud, right? On both sides, on the side of the fraudsters, how is that helping them? And on the side of companies and providers like yourself that are trying to literally mitigate the abilities that fraudsters have to commit fraud.
I would say that the use of AI in fraud is rampant right now, and it's happening in a way that is accelerating all of the existing types of fraud, right? So if you think about like the identity verification process, in which you're requesting users to take a picture of their document and then take a selfie and then like go through liveness detection by like moving your head around, it has become so easy to bypass this with the use of AI, right? Like the deep fakes are incredibly good nowadays. It's very hard to distinguish a deep fake from a real video. Even I think I saw in the New York Times, like one of the most important researchers in the deepfake space. He is a professor at Berkeley. He said like we got to this point in which not even myself can like distinguish this anymore, right? So it's near perfect nowadays. The other thing is that AI is enabling fraudsters to run much better social engineering campaigns. So, for example, imagine the classic Nigerian prince email that like they would reach out to multiple people and ask them to like help them settle a transaction and keep part of it, etc. Like that was still effective early on, but like for someone that was a little bit more well trained, it was very easy to spot that this was a scam, right? But nowadays, like the text is perfect. The level of personalization in these phishing campaigns is incredible, because like you have so much information on social media about you that can be used to personalize the message, for example. You have all these data breaches that can help these scammers know a lot about you, right? And when you put that into an LLM, you can have a different message to each individual. It's not going to be like that standard email or text that you're going to send to like thousands of people. It's going to be a one-to-one campaign, which is incredible nowadays. So phishing campaigns are more effective. Social engineering campaigns are more effective. And there is one other aspect to the use of AI in fraud, which is, I would say, for me, the most concerning, because it's not going to change, is that the fraudsters are already breaking the law. So they don't care about any like AI regulation, any privacy regulation, any financial services regulation. And as a result, they can move faster, right? They can test things more quickly, then they can iterate, they can learn. and there's also another aspect, which is there's no competition between fraudsters. In the end, like they're stealing money from consumers and financial institutions, but they're not stealing from each other. So they're sharing more information, they're sharing knowledge, they're sharing tools, and they're using AI also to build better tools to scale up their programs. And agents, for example, are one of the most scalable things that fraudsters are now using to accelerate their attacks. So yeah, I would say it's quite asymmetric in terms of like the use of AI on the fraudster side versus the fraud fighter side. So yeah, it's hard to keep up, and that's why we decided to make this bet on focusing on a signal that AI would have a much harder time faking, because you cannot fake what's happening in the physical world. But yeah, it's only going to become more challenging.
If I was a fraudster, I would go and try to defraud the fraudsters, like Robin Hood type thing. That would probably be what I would want to do. So maybe I wouldn't be too bad of a fraudster. But the second piece that was interesting in what you said is, I do think that fraudsters, by definition, are somewhat competitive. So I don't know if they don't compete with each other just because, like, hey, I can be better at being a fraudster than you are. But again, maybe a conversation for us to have one day with a glass of wine or a beer. Looking at the next frontier, right? Everyone's talking about agentic. I think today something else, right, that's coming into play is the blockchain. And that technology and how that differs. How do you see, like agents ultimately coming and being able to be, like humans opening those accounts and potentially being part of the fraud, or just, the identification component that you're mentioning, right? They won't be physical world for them to be there. How do you see kind of, Incognia's solution and just like that problem of APP fraud evolving because of agents?
Yeah, I would say there are, I'd say, 3 layers to this. So the first challenge when it comes to agentic workflows is that you have to have a way to bind the agent to the person in a continuous way, right? So it's very similar to the mule account problem, which is like when you're going through the onboarding, like everything is fine, but then at some point the account is then used by someone else. The same could happen with agents, right? Like I can set up my agents, but eventually if someone is able to take over my account or hijack my session, they're able to take control of my agent and ask my agent to do things that I don't want, right? So you have to have a way to continuously verify that the agent is still linked to the same person and the real person, right? So that's one challenge. This is one area in which we can contribute more directly, which is in the same way that we're already addressing this for other companies. But there are 2 other layers to this problem, right? The second here is identifying the agent, right? So it's the know your agent problem. So ensuring that this is still the same agent that initiated whatever transaction or session with an external service, right? So for example, when the agent presents themselves to, let's say, a banking application or an e-commerce website, there has to be a way for that bank or that e-commerce website to verify, is this agent really who they claim to represent, right? And in that sense, like there are already some protocols for agents to basically authenticate themselves using cryptographic signatures. So this is something that could be addressed with cryptography. And then I would say that the third layer here is more around verifying intent and also being able to maintain a record of all the decisions and all the actions that agent has taken. So this is one area in which blockchain can come in, for example, like maintaining that history of everything that agent has done in the past, so that you can go back eventually and see if there was any anomaly, any change in behavior, anything that went outside what the user originally instructed to that agent, right? And the intent piece is also very critical, which is understanding the real intent of that agent and being able to track if this was the action that was taken. So finding ways to like audit that process will be very, very important as well. So we contribute to the first piece. The other two, I'd say, like there are other protocols that can help address it.
It sounds like the blockchain itself, just in general, because it is a ledger and it can ultimately like reconcile and store different type of information into one place. Hopefully that can also be edited, right? I think that's the one piece that we haven't had as much advancements on in terms of innovation is okay, like the storage component of the blockchain is great, right? But like, how do you use that information ultimately and start being able to run like queries, I guess, on top of it, which is something that I'm hopefully going to see, and we are hopefully going to see more innovation on. I guess one very, very quick question on the identity layer. Do you think that because of the innovation we're seeing, there's a need for a new identity layer, or would you say that ultimately things should continue to evolve, right? Because they're not static, but should ultimately remain more or less the way they are right now?
Yeah, I would say it has to continue evolving. These things cannot be static. But I would say that the foundation is already here. It's just like there's not a need for a new like revolutionary thing. It's more about like using the right pieces to build the more modern stack for it. So for example, what we introduced to this industry was the use of like hyper precise location, but that's not like the only thing that you should use. For example, like you should use that in combination with a very strong identifier for the device. You should use that in conjunction with sophisticated like biometrics and liveness detection, for example. Like document verification still will be around despite the advancements in deepfakes, but the question is like, how do you ensure that the data is real and not tampered with? So there's a lot of like capabilities around like application integrity, device integrity, to ensure that the fraudster is not using a fake camera, for example, which is quite common nowadays. So it's a multi-layered approach. I think the layers are already here, and each individual layer will continue to evolve. But there's no need for like a whole new approach to this. It's just like using them in the right order, and ensuring that you're using the best-in-class solutions for each of these different layers.
I now understand more and more why they are risk professionals that spend their entire like life on the risk side of things, just because of the complexity and the different layers that you have to deal with and the forever evolving landscape. I guess, don't want to take too much of your time because you're busy. But I had like 3 quick questions, right, that I wanted to do like as a fire chat almost. So quick question, quick answer, and then, I'll free you up. What's the one thing you wish that every payment risk executive understood about APP fraud that they currently do not?
How to identify mule accounts.
What's next for Incognia, and where are you taking the company?
Well, we're now at 1.5 billion users globally. getting closer to the entire population, I'd say, is one of the key things, which means continuing to expand our footprint. And besides growth, I would say continuing to innovate on the product front, because this is not the type of space in which you can feel comfortable because the solutions work extremely well. It is today, but we can't settle. We need to continue innovating and keeping at the bleeding edge.
And last but not least, what are the next markets?
Well, I would say, like nowadays, like financial services and marketplaces represent almost 90% of our business, but we're seeing a lot of demand in other places, like, for example, the streaming industry, like a lot of entertainment companies starting to use the service to identify things like account sharing and other things. Gaming, there is also fraud in that space. Social media, dating applications, there are like lots of scams that initiate in those platforms, and they also want to address it. So yeah, we see a lot of opportunity. I would say, like, in the end of the day, every single online service needs better ways to identify their users so that they can ensure the integrity of their platforms. And in the end, like, the solution that works for a bank can help a social media company in the same way.
André, thank you for the time. I hope that the audience, everyone that will take a second to listen to this, learned as much as I did. I'm a nerd, so I think this is fascinating. I think there's so much to actually do and learn about. What you guys are doing is incredible. Appreciate your time. Any last words before we close this out?
No, really appreciate the time as well. It was a pleasure. And if anyone wants to engage and speak directly, like I'm always like engaging with people on LinkedIn and all other social media platforms. So happy to talk about how to help identify fraudsters and ensure that they stay away.
We'll make sure to put your LinkedIn on the post in the comments and everything.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Good luck with the beautiful background that you have, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Talk soon.